Chains of thought are the quiet architecture behind everything we think and do. On the surface, most thoughts feel sudden, almost accidental. An idea appears, a memory surfaces, a judgment arrives. But under that apparent spontaneity, there is usually a sequence, a path from one mental step to the next. A chain of thought is that path. The reasonable deductions from a premise that lead from one thought to the next, not necessarily towards a final conclusion, but towards some shift in perception, emotion, or action. We live inside these chains without noticing them. We make decisions, form beliefs, and narrate our lives according to links that feel obvious, but which we rarely examine. Giving them a name is the first step towards reclaiming them. Most people experience their inner life as scattered dots of awareness. A phrase someone said in passing, a glance from a stranger, an old memory, an unexpected worry on a quiet afternoon. But dots don't just float in isolation. They are joined by invisible bridges. You see a friend's last seen status online, you notice they haven't replied to your message, and before you know it, you've crossed from a neutral observation to, they must be annoyed with me. Each step felt reasonable at the time. First, they haven't replied. Second, when people ignore me, it usually means they are upset. Third, if they are upset, I must have done something wrong. Fourth, I am a problem. At no point did you think, I will now construct a self-punishing narrative. You simply followed a chain that presented itself as obvious. The dots were visible, the chain between them was not. This is one of the strange powers of chains of thought. They feel natural, even inevitable from the inside. Each link carries a sense of course. Of course they're upset. Of course it's my fault. Of course this always happens to me. Yet if you slow the chain down, if you take each link in your hands and hold it up to the light, that inevitability begins to dissolve. You start to see that there is a difference between what is given and what is added. The given is the bare fact. There is no reply yet. The added is everything you build on top of it. Assumptions, memories, fears, narratives. Chains of thought are not just about deduction. They are about addition. We add ourselves to the world and then mistake that addition for the world itself. A chain of thought can be locally reasonable and globally misleading. From one step to the next, everything can make sense, and yet the overall direction can be wrong. Consider a simple financial example. Suppose a market has been rising for months. You see green candles on a chart, you read headlines about new highs, your social feeds are full of people celebrating profits. Your chain of thought might unfold like this. The market is going up. Things that go up must be good. Good things will probably continue. If I don't get in now, I will miss out. Missing out is painful. Therefore, I must act now and buy. Each link is understandable. You are responding to patterns, reward, and fear. But anyone who has watched markets for long enough knows how often such chains march people to the edge of a cliff. What felt like reasonable deduction was also emotional momentum disguised as logic. The same pattern appears in more intimate domains. Take the story, "My life is going nowhere." It rarely begins as an abstract statement. It starts from something small, a job rejection, a project that stalled, a bad week, a sense of tiredness that will not leave. From there, the chain forms. I must not be good enough. If I am not good enough here, maybe I'm not good enough anywhere. Other people my age seem further ahead. I am behind. If I am behind now, I will always be behind. I am doomed to live a lesser life. It is not enough to say that's irrational. When you inhabit that chain from the inside, each step feels like a grim kind of honesty. The trouble is not that there is no logic. The trouble is the ghost premises hidden underneath the steps. I am only valuable if I succeed. Falling behind once means I will fall behind forever. Other people's visible milestones are a fair comparison to my invisible struggles. These unspoken beliefs act as anchors. They fix the direction of the chain before the first step is even taken. Chains of thought are almost always built on such ghost premises. They are the rules we absorbed early, the myths about ourselves and the world that we never consciously agreed to but quietly lived by. People like me are always on the outside. If something goes wrong, it is probably my fault. If I do not understand something quickly, it means I am stupid. Authority figures are usually right, and I am usually wrong. When a new situation arises, these premises do not announce themselves. They sit in the background, waiting, ready to shape how each new piece of information is interpreted. The same event can trigger very different chains in different minds, not because the event is different, but because the ghost premises are. This is why one person hears silence from a friend and thinks, they must be busy, while another hears the same silence and feels, they must hate me. It is why one person sees a failed business idea as a specific lesson about a particular market, while another sees it as a verdict on their entire identity. The chain is not just a line of pure reasoning. It is a negotiation between perception, memory, emotion, and belief. There is logic in it, but it is entangled with fear and hope. If you pay close attention, you will notice another feature. Many chains of thought do not actually want conclusions. We are trained to prize closure. We like the feeling of therefore, the final line of a proof, the moment a mystery is solved, the sentence that pins everything down. Yet some of the most important chains in our lives are not meant to terminate. They are meant to open. Questions of meaning, ethics, faith, purpose, identity do not lend themselves to a single decisive endpoint. When you explore them honestly, your chains of thought look less like proofs and more like pilgrimages. You start from a premise that life is finite, that suffering is real, that love matters, that the universe is indifferent, that there is or is not something beyond matter, and you trace what follows. Not to arrive at a slogan, but to see what kind of life unfolds if you treat that premise as real. In this sense, a chain of thought is not always trying to kill a question with an answer. Sometimes it is trying to intensify the question until it transforms you. If I take seriously the idea that my time is limited, what does that imply for how I spend this afternoon? If I treat every person I meet as carrying an invisible weight, how does that alter how I speak to them? If I accept that my perception is always partial, how does that change my certainty about my own judgments? These chains might never end in a tidy, therefore, but they subtly reshape the architecture of your decisions and your presence in the world. It is useful then to imagine chains of thought not as straight lines, but as branching paths. From a single premise, multiple chains are available. A business failure might prompt one chain that says, I am not cut out for this, another that says, this approach, in this context, did not work, and a third that says, I have just paid tuition for a lesson about execution, timing, and resilience. All three can feel plausible. The question is not only which one is logically cleanest, but which one is truest and most life-giving. In other words, which chain are you willing to inhabit? Which story are you prepared to let sculpt your character and your future choices? This is where agency enters. You cannot always control the first thought that appears. It is the product of conditioning, context, biology, habit. But once you have named the existence of chains, you can begin to influence what happens next. You can pause long enough to ask, from here, what other links are possible? You can notice when a familiar chain is reappearing, the chain that always ends in, I am worthless, or the world is against me, or this will never work, and gently step sideways. You can generate alternative branches. Maybe they are not replying because they are overwhelmed, not because they hate me. Or maybe this failure is the price of learning something others haven't dared to attempt. This is not about positive thinking in a shallow sense. It is about respecting that there are usually several reasonable paths available, and that you are not obliged to surrender to the first one that fear hands you. Emotion deserves an explicit place in this picture. Chains of thought are often drawn by feelings as much as by facts. Fear tilts the chain towards defensive conclusions. Assume the worst, retreat, avoid risk. Shame bends it back onto the self. If anything goes wrong, I am the fault line. Desire stretches it towards fantasies. This one opportunity will solve everything. This one person will fix me. This one success will finally make me enough. If you look closely at the jumps between thoughts, you will often find an emotion sitting between them, acting as the hidden bridge. The mind says, they haven't replied, they must hate me. But underneath it, the heart is saying, I am terrified of being abandoned, and this feels safer than waiting in uncertainty. Honing your chains of thought requires an honesty about these emotional currents. You cannot purify your thinking by ignoring your feelings. You refine it by learning to name them and factor them in consciously. Over time, you can also cultivate a second-order chain, a chain of thought about your chains of thought. This is the beginning of metacognition, the mind turning its attention back on its own processes. You notice that after every small social setback, you run the same script. You trace it. First comes the trigger, then the ghost premise, then the self-judgment, then the withdrawal. You see how old experiences have shaped your default responses. Perhaps you recognize a parent's voice hidden somewhere in your own inner critic, or the echo of a teacher's dismissive remark still reverberating years later. By laying out the sequence, you gain the power to alter it. The chain is no longer an invisible law. It becomes something you can edit. Honing your chains of thought is not about turning yourself into a cold, hyper-rational machine. It is about cultivating a more faithful relationship to reality and a more compassionate relationship to yourself. It begins with slowness. When you catch yourself at the end of a heavy conclusion, "I'll never make it," "They must despise me," "Everything is doomed," you can walk the chain backwards. What was the last link before this one? And before that? Where did I make the first leap from fact to interpretation? Often you will discover a small, almost casual assumption that sent the whole thing off course. From there, you can start to experiment at the level of premises. You can gently question your ghost rules. Is it really true that if someone does not respond, it means I did something wrong? Is it really true that one failure defines me forever? Is it really true that if I am not exceptional, I am worthless? You might find it helpful to speak to yourself as you would to someone you love. If a close friend brought you the same chain of thought, would you endorse every link without hesitation, or would you offer them a kinder, wider view? You can also train yourself to generate multiple chains from the same starting point. When something significant happens, resist the urge to settle instantly on one interpretation. Treat it as an exercise. Ask, what are 3 different ways to read this? What follows if I interpret it as punishment? What follows if I read it as opportunity? What follows if I see it as neutral information, an invitation to adapt rather than to judge? In doing so, you stretch the space between stimulus and response. You loosen the tyranny of the first narrative that arrives. Lastly, there is an art in knowing when not to force an ending. Some questions are not problems to solve, but companions to walk with. When you enter those territories, meaning mortality, love, suffering, God, the nature of reality, allow your chains of thought to remain open-ended. Follow their implications. Let them challenge your habits and your comfort, but do not rush to hammer them into a slogan. There is a kind of wisdom that only appears in the tension between possibilities, a depth that only emerges when you are willing to live inside a question without the comfort of quick resolution. Chains of thought are always active, whether we name them or not. They are the unseen rails along which our attention, our interpretations, and our choices move. To become aware of them is to reclaim a measure of authorship over your inner life. You may not control every thought that appears, nor every emotion that flows through you, but you can learn to shape the paths they take, to soften harsh verdicts, to open cramped horizons, and to let some questions remain alive instead of strangled by premature answers. In that sense, honing your chains of thought is not only an intellectual discipline, it is a quiet act of care for the person you are becoming.